Welcome back for session 2. It's going to be just an add-on of what we did in the last session. Hopefully it still maintains that level of ease and comfort. The first session, as you experienced, was more about just figuring out how your pelvis moves and how your pelvis relates to your low back and how you can activate very subtle muscles that are quite important to stabilize your body. Today is going to be a bit more on what I would like to call crossbody. So figuring out how sort of rotation feels, how crossing legs feel, and stuff like that that put a little bit more emphasis on our hips. Of course, if anything during this feels uncomfortable or not right, back off or stop. It should hopefully maintain that level of continuous pleasure. So, which is hard because often we don't associate exercise and movement with feeling good. We associate it with doing work. So if you can, find that place where it feels good, you're enjoying it, it's pleasurable, you could do it for a while, and that type of sensation. So once again, mat and light little pillow for your head, and we should be good with that. So set yourself up, lay down onto your mat, get yourself comfy with your pillow, so the right heights and everything, so that we are at a place where it feels quite good to be laying. And starting, you'll have your feet flat on the ground, knees pointing up to the ceiling, and then your back just wherever it wants to go to start with. So, building on, we'll start with what we did last session. Press it down with your tailbone. Once again, just that quarter capacity. Bit more reason why is that quarter capacity is such a low level of exertion. It actually initiates activation from deep stabilizing muscles instead of the more superficial power muscles. That's what we want to start to look for, is how can we get these very subtle small muscles to activate. And then release the tailbone, press down with your bladder. Same thing, just that little quarter capacity. Feel the activation. See if you can relax anything else. So maybe glutes or thighs, inner legs, feet, shoulders. Press down with your tailbone. Same thing. Anything you can relax around your hips, around your pelvis, in your legs, in your feet, in your shoulders. And relax. Bladder pressing down. And this time we'll add a little bit more into it. So what it's going to be is just a slight release, and then press it down again in with your bladder. Slight release, press down with your bladder. Slight release, press back down with your bladder. Slight release, press down with your bladder. So keep with this little motion of release and press. Release and press. I'm going to say a few things as you continue at this slow pace. And what I like you to do is, as you do this, watch what you're doing with the larger muscles or other muscles around your stomach, around your back, around your hips and your legs. So notice if you are using other muscles, if you're trying to engage other muscles, if other muscles are engaging without you trying. And see if you can then back off in how much you're trying to do, so that once again, it is just that tiny activation, subtle activation right at the low part of your pelvis, so that you just pulse it on and release. Pulse on, pressing down in other words, and release. Pressing down, release. Pressing down, release. pressing down, and fully release. And then we'll go for the tailbone part of it. So start again, pressing down with your tailbone. You might get a slight arch in your back, that's okay. And then ease off, slight release, press down again. Slight release, press down again. Release, press. Release, press. Release, press. So once again, keep with that pace. See what's happening with the rest of your body. Your pelvis, your hips, your legs, your stomach, your chest, your trunk, your head, your shoulders, your neck. So that you can notice what else is trying to engage while you're pressing down with your tailbone. And see if you can minimize how much is activating. So it comes down to the least amount of muscles, the least amount of effort. So pressing and releasing. Pressing and releasing. Go for another couples. Press, release. Press and release. Last one. Press the tailbone and release. Good. So you can take a break however you want. Your knees can sit together. You can straighten your legs. But all we were doing for this motion was switching on deep stabilizers. And you might want to know why I'm doing that when we're talking about your hips. And that's because a huge piece of what happens for hip arthritis comes down to how we have our hips positioned. So, in other words, if we can find a way to alter how our pelvis and low back position, that then alters how our hips are positioned. And so then with the position of our hips, that impacts how we load them. So if we continuously load the areas that have been of load, that will continue to feel aggravating. But if you can alter loading patterns, then it can, not in all circumstances, but on some level, benefit you by easing off in the pain, easing off in the irritation of continuously loading places that are already irritated. So now the next bit here is what I wanted you to go into is now go back to press down with your bladder and press down with your tailbone. The process as you do this is less about doing it right, less about doing it well, and more now about noticing which one feels more relieving. You probably have some aspect of already understanding that by doing this, but now I'd like you to really notice which tilt. Is it pressing down with your tailbone? Or is it pressing down with your bladder? Or somewhere in between that feels the best, that feels maybe, there's so many words, maybe most stable, maybe it's most secure, maybe it's most controlled, maybe it's the most relaxed, maybe, you get my point. There's a lot of things that you can recognize as feeling the best, and that's where I want you to go to that point where it feels good. You're like, that's the ticket. Now, if you don't find one that's at that level, find one that feels closest to that level. And then from here, what we're going to do is now shift your weight just a bit. So now you press down more with the left side of your pelvis in that same line, and then back to the middle. Now press down with your right side of your pelvis and back to the middle. So in other words, you still have that same pressing down motion, whether it's at your bladder, at your tailbone, or somewhere in the middle, but then you take that spot, which is central, and shift it over to your left. So then you press down with that point on your left side, and then shift back to a middle, that same middle ground that felt good, and then take that point, shift it onto your right side, so you press down on your right side. Now, depending on how big of a motion you go for, you may get knee movement, just a small little bit, or you might get an actual twist. Either way, whatever you want to do. Bigger is not better. Less is not more. It's really your preference, whatever feels best for you. And that's the biggest part of this process, is learning what feels good for your body. So pressing down into that spot once again that felt quite good, whether it was bladder or tailbone. Now shift it back to the left, press there, pause, back to the middle. Shift to the right, press there, pause, and middle. Press on the left, pause, and middle. Press on the right, pause, and middle. Once more to each side. Press on the left, pause, middle. Press on the right, pause, and middle. Just take a nice pause. What I want you to look for now is, how do your hips feel? How does your back feel? How does your pelvis feel? Did that whole thing feel very easy? Or did you feel some discomfort during it? Which part, the pressing on the left, pressing on the right, or somewhere in between, which part felt really nice? And then which part did you not really enjoy? So all of this, of course, is a part of the process of understanding what your body enjoys and what it does not at this stage. What I'd like you to do is now go to the spot that felt good. So you probably won't have the same thing that I will. My spot that felt really good is slightly pressing onto my right side, not fully on the right, but just before there. So I want you to go back to that spot where you're like, yeah, that's what I remember feeling good. Go there and then pause. And as you pause now, I'd like you to just close your eyes. Keep with that position. Take a nice big breath. And then ease out, come back to a middle. Once again, let yourself settle for a moment. Let yourself see how that feels. Come back to it again. That spot that felt really good. Pause there. And if you like, once again, you can close your eyes, or you can add a little movement. So I'm choosing a little bit of a sway left and right, but you can also choose a little movement with your knee. You can choose a little tilting with your pelvis. You can choose a movement with your head. There's really endless amounts of things that you can do. The first one that comes to mind is probably the best. That is usually what your body's craving, and go with it. A huge process of injury recovery is the process of understanding what is your body's desire versus what is it that our mind wants our body to do. Two totally different things. Usually the best way to differentiate is something that's more of a body craving that you do without thinking is pretty much a good indicator that it's your body's request based on what it wants to do to make it feel better. And then relax back to a middle. So now take that pause, see how you feel. We're going to go back into tilting where we had started and what we did last week, or last session, I should say. Press down with your tailbone and press down with your bladder. Tailbone and bladder. Now, as you do this, I'm sure you've now become a bit more familiar with how to do this tilting of lightly pressing with your bladder and lightly pressing with your tailbone. Where I'd like you to notice is what feels different. Maybe there's a different sense of of motion. Maybe it's easier, maybe it's challenging, maybe it's more stable, maybe it's more open. Maybe it feels warmer, maybe it feels colder. There's so many descriptors that you can use to describe it. So I want you to just recognize what are the first descriptors that come to mind, or the first sensations that you recognize as different. For me, I feel a bit more input on that side and feels warmer, maybe a little bit tingly, but not tingly as in a bad tingle, just a tingle as in activity. And then take a pause now somewhere in between those tilts where it feels the best. And that might have changed. It likely has changed. So if it has, take that with a grain of curiosity. Don't know if that's a phrase, but let me tell you it should be. And then pause in that spot. Now, what we're going to do from here is going to be with our legs. And where I'd like you to go is now tilt your knees over to your left side, keeping that same downward press in the spot that feels good. Pause with tilting when you notice enough. And then back to a middle. Still pressing down with that spot that felt good in your tilt. So somewhere between your tailbone and your bladder. Now tilt your knees over to the right. Same thing. Go only to where you know it's enough. And enough is an interesting word. Come back to the middle. Enough doesn't necessarily have to be a big stretch or a big workout. Enough is that point where it borders on losing pleasure and overindulgence. So enough is prior to overindulging, overdoing it. Enough is at that point where it's still enjoyable. And that's the place where you want to go. Pause when it's still enjoyable, when it's enough. So now tilt your knees back over to the left. Stop when it's enough. Middle. Still pressing down. Now knees go to the right. Pausing when it's enough. And middle. Now to the left. Pausing when it's enough. Middle. To the right. Pausing when it's enough. Middle. Now release the pressing down and just relax. So do whatever position you want that feels good to relax. And if you can guess, if you've learned anything about the process that I go through, we're going to do that again. But we'll change it up just a little bit. So find that spot that it feels good to press down with. So somewhere between the tip of your tailbone and your bladder. Now pausing there. Keep with that downward press. Same thing. Doesn't have to be huge. It could just be that enough of an emphasis, more of an intention than a full effort. Now tilt your knees to the left. Pause when you feel it's enough. And then what you're going to do from here is slightly step away from enough. So then it's before you feel like it's enough. And you pause here. And now add a little pulse with your knees. So you're going from slightly before enough to enough. Slightly before enough to enough. So that it's a little rock. I tend to like to think about it like you're in a rocking chair. Just a nice easy rock. You can almost lull yourself to sleep by rocking. And then take a break, come back to a middle. Press down again with that spot between your tailbone and your bladder. Tilt back to the left. And notice if that range to enough has changed. Maybe you can go a little bit more before it feels like enough. Maybe you can't, and that's okay too. And then back to a middle. Relax, ease off the pressing down. Then press down again somewhere in the middle of your two tilts. somewhere between your tip of your tailbone and your bladder. Now go to the right with your knees, shifting over until you feel like it's enough. Back out, so you're just before enough. And then that tiny little rocking, that tiny little pulsing. So you're going from just before enough to enough. Before, two, before, two, before, two. So find that little pace where it could lull you to sleep. Good. And then come back to the middle and release. Give yourself a little shake. Maybe you need to reposition your head or your neck or your body or anything else. Good. Now, what we're going to do is sort of the next step. And it's not going to be too much, I hope, but let me know. So where I'd like you to go to first is pressing down with your bladder and pressing down with the tip of your tailbone. Bladder, tailbone. Now, as we've done this already, find that range where it feels the best and then pause there. As I've said before, it might have changed. It probably has changed your body. Our bodies continue to change. So, it's more of that fascination, in my mind, of, wow, this is pretty cool that things can change like this. Then find that spot that feels right for you to keep with as you're pressing down. And now shift over to your left, just to that point where it's enough, as we've talked about. Now what you're going to do from here is you're just going to slightly press down with your right heel so that your right heel presses down and your right glute hopefully just switches on so that as you push down with your right heel, your right hip slightly lifts off the ground. And then release, come back to a middle. Find that spot to press down somewhere between your tailbone and your bladder. Shift to your right, just that point where it's enough. Press down with your left heel, pressing down, and so that your left hip starts to lift off the ground. Just slow, very small. And then release it back down. Take a break in the middle. Find that spot again between your pubic bone or between your tailbone and your bladder. Shift over to your left to the point where it feels like enough. Press down with your right heel so then your right hip begins to lift off the ground just a smidge. We're not really going for anything major. We're not really trying to lift our bottom off. We're really focusing more on pressing down with the heel. And if our bottom lifts, it lifts. If it goes high, it goes high. If it stays low, it stays low. That's okay. More important to think about the heel pressing down. And then ease out. Find that spot between your tailbone and bladder again. Press down. Shift over to your right to the point where it's enough. Press down with your left heel. Pressing. Same thing. Doesn't have to be high. Doesn't have to be low. Doesn't have to be any of it. It's more important to just maintain that continuous downward press with the center of your heel. And then relax. Now find that spot again, last time to each side, between your tailbone and your bladder, pressing down, shifting over to your left to the point where it's enough. Press down with your right heel. Your bottom may lift, and wherever it lifts to or doesn't lift to, stay there. Keep pressing down with your right heel. If you can imagine, or just go for it instead of imagining, all of your attention is on that right heel pressing down. Anything else that's happening in that right leg or left leg is not as important. It's more important to keep pressing down and let everything else adjust to that right heel pressing down. If it feels uncomfortable in your hip, press less. And then release back to a middle. Press down between your tailbone and your bladder, wherever it feels best. Shift over to your right, to that point where it's enough. And then press down with your left heel. Same thing. Continuously emphasizing the left heel as your most important part. Everything else can adjust around it. If your bottom lifts, cool. If your hips rotate, cool. Not as important. More important, that continuous downward pressure, downward press of your left heel, only enough so that you don't feel discomfort in your hips. And then release back to the middle. Good. Just relax from pressing anything or anywhere, and let yourself just sway left and right with your knees, with your back, with your bottom, using the ground as almost as a way of massaging through your hips, like you're Blue from Jungle Book using a tree to scratch his back. Same idea with your bottom, same idea with your feet and your low back. And then straighten your legs out. Let yourself relax. Hands can come wherever they want. Shut your eyes. Use the moment as integration. Seeing what feels different. Maybe noticing what doesn't feel different. Nice thing to reflect on in integration time is, what temperatures do you feel? Do you feel new temperatures, as in heat in different places? Do you feel colds in different places? Do you feel continuity of temperature? Or do you feel a variety of temperatures in your body, particularly around your hips, your pelvis, and your low back? Temperature is a really good indicator of circulation. And that's why it's such of importance of recognition of, okay, where did my blood decide to circulate from these exercises? And then maybe any other sensations. Maybe there's a different sensation that you hadn't noticed. You don't have to describe it, but it's really good to pay attention to it and give it your attention. Curiosity is my number one word when it comes to injuries. Is, be curious by what's happening, what's your body telling you, what's your body showing you. And our body speaks differently than our mind. Our mind speaks very logically with words. Our body speaks with sensations. So it's about becoming very aware of the sensations in our body to understand what our body is saying and what it's requesting. And there you are. You can keep relaxing if you like, or if you're ready to come up, come on up. I hope you enjoyed, and I will return again with another session. If you feel like this one's enough, keep here, keep going at it, see how you feel in the next couple days. You might find that this was enough for your body. And if it is, keep with that. It's good to try this every couple days. So at least every 2 or 3 days, just so that you can feel those gradual improvements or changes. You can do it every day if your body feels like it's okay to do it every day. But if it feels like it needs a day off, give it a day off. All right. Until next time, let me know if you have any questions.